Chapter 26 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Olivia. Captivating Bible Stories for Young People by Charlotte Mary Yonge. Chapter 26. The 26th Sunday. The Kingdom of Israel. First reading. This thing became a sin. 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 30. Solomon's son was named Rehoboam. He was foolish and hasty, and when his father's wise old men gave him good advice, he would not listen to them, but only cared for his young friends, who were as foolish as himself. So when the Israelites came to ask him not to be so hard upon them and make them bring him so much corn and so many sheep, the old men told him to answer them kindly and gently. But the young men said he had better be fierce and sharp. So he followed the young men's advice and made a very unkind answer. This made them all so angry that they said they would not have him for their king any longer, but they took Jeroboam, a brave, strong man of the tribe of Ephraim, and made him their king. Only 2 tribes still held steady to Rehoboam. They were the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. God left him these because of the promise that King David's sons should go on sitting on his throne. But 10 of the tribes had made Jeroboam their king, so that now there were 2 kingdoms, a large one called Israel and a small one called Judah. This was because Solomon had let his heart turn away from God and had not taken pains to keep his people holy, but had cared more for riches and power and glory. But Jeroboam did not take pains to serve God. He set up 2 calves made of gold for the Israelites to worship instead of going to the temple. Second reading. I may not return with thee, nor go in with thee. 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 16. It's a sad story that you hear today. There was a man who was called a prophet, because God spoke to him, and used to send him to declare his will to the people. Once God called this prophet and told him to go to a place called Bethel, where the wicked king of Israel, Jeroboam, had set up a golden idol in the shape of a calf, and was teaching the people to pray to it, instead of going to the temple at Jerusalem to worship. He was to tell the king of his sin, and how his idol should be overthrown and destroyed, and when he had done this, he was to come home at once, by a different way, and neither eat bread nor drink water, but come quickly back. The prophet went to Bethel, and he spoke God's words to the king boldly. And when the king put out his hand to strike him, God struck the hand, so Jeroboam could not draw it back, till the prophet prayed for him. Then Jeroboam felt God's power, and wanted the prophet to come to his palace with him. But the prophet said no, for God had commanded him to go home at once, without eating or drinking in that wicked place. So he set off. He had, so far, done well, but before he had gone all the way, he grew tired, and he sat down under an oak. It was a great pity that he delayed, for there was a bad man coming after him with a lie upon his lips. This man told the prophet that God had said he was to come back and eat and drink, and I am grieved to say that the prophet listened and turned back. He ought to have known that God would have told him himself if he was to go back, but he did not think. He did what pleased himself, not what pleased God, and he went back to feast with this stranger. But God's anger came upon him. When he went back in the evening, a lion came out of the wood and killed him. The lion did not kill the ass he rode upon, nor tear the body, and the ass did not run away from the lion, but the lion and ass both stood by the dead prophet until, who do you think found him? The very man who had tempted him to do wrong. Must not that have been a terrible sight? Third reading. The barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 14. Third reading. The barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 14. It's very sad to say, but the Israelites went on getting more fond of idols and would not worship God. They grew so wicked that at last he punished them to teach them who sent the rain and did them good. He would not let it rain for 3 whole years. No rain by day, no dew by night. The corn would not grow, the grass dried up, and all the streams were nothing but stones. So there was nothing to eat or to drink, and everyone was in sad distress. There was one good man, a prophet, called Elijah, and God took care of him. He sent him to a lonely place by the side of a little mountain stream, where there still was water to drink. And every morning and evening there came 2 ravens, who were sent by God to bring him bread and flesh. That was a great miracle, or wonder, which God worked to feed his prophet. In time the brook dried up, and then God sent Elijah to a town called Zarephath. There Elijah saw a poor woman gathering sticks, and he asked her to give him a little bit of something to eat. But the poor widow woman said she had nothing for herself and her son but a handful of meal and a little oil, and she was going to make a cake of it and bake it with the fire of her sticks, and that was the last she could get, so they must die of hunger after they had finished. But Elijah still told her to make him a little cake first, for he said, "Thus saith the Lord of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth." And the woman believed him, and gave him a bit of her last cake. And it was as he said. There was always meal and oil enough to feed them day by day. The widow and her son and the prophet went on living on the meal every day, for God fed them. At last the child fell sick and died, and his mother grieved for him. But Elijah laid the child on his bed and prayed to God to have mercy on the widow, and God had mercy. The little child's soul came back, and he was alive again, and Elijah gave him to his mother. Are not these three great wonders of God's goodness? God does not let us see miracles now as he did in those times, because we are taught to believe in him without them. But he still takes care of us. He takes care that if we trust to him and pray to him, we shall have our food every day. And if we are ready to give what we want ourselves away to one who needs it, he will make it up to us and take care of us all the more. And though no one is brought to life now who has died, yet God often gives us back our friends when they have been very ill, and we know that we shall all rise up from the dead and live with God forever at a greater call than Elijah's. End of chapter 26. Recording by Olivia.
Chapter 27 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 27th Sunday. Elijah and Ahab. First reading. The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. 1 Kings 18:39. You heard last Sunday how sadly the Israelites were behaving when they prayed to a golden calf. They had a still worse idol afterwards. His name was Baal, and they wanted to worship him instead of the true God. Today there is a beautiful chapter that I hardly like to put into my own poor words. Listen to it well in church, and you will hear how wonderful it is. There are 400 prophets, as they called themselves, who worshipped Baal, and only one real prophet who worshipped the Lord God. This prophet was named Elijah. He called all the people to a high mountain, and said they should see who was the true God. He said he would build one altar, and that the 400 prophets should build another. They should each offer a sacrifice, and each should pray to his God, and the God that sent fire to burn the sacrifice would be the true God. The prophets of Baal tried first. They built their altar, and put wood on it, and killed a bullock, and cut it up. And they prayed to their god Baal to send fire down. But he was no god, he was nothing at all. And though they cried and shouted, and leaped about, and even cut their own flesh in their rage, not a spark of fire came. Then Elijah made his sacrifice, and he did a strange thing, for he had water poured all over it, till all the wood was streaming wet. And you know water always puts out fire, so how was it ever to be burnt? He even made a trench round, and filled that with water too. Then he knelt down, and prayed that the Lord God in heaven would show his power, and make the people know that no one else was God. And down from heaven came the fire. It was not stopped by the water, No, it dried that up in a moment, and burnt the wood, and consumed the sacrifice. And all the Israelites fell on their faces, and cried out, The Lord, He is the God! The Lord, He is the God! For only the Lord God is almighty, and can do wonders. Second reading. A still small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. After the Israelites had called out, The Lord, He is the God, and owned that Baal was nothing but an idol, God had mercy on them, and sent them rain again, and their famine was over. But King Ahab's wife, whose name was Jezebel, was a heathen woman, and she would worship Baal, and did not choose to believe in the true God. And she was very angry with Elijah, and sent men out everywhere to put him to death. Elijah was obliged to flee far away for fear of her, and he went out into the wilderness, and sat down under a juniper tree. And there he was so sad to think that all he had done was of no use, that he requested for himself that he might die, for he could do no more good with these wicked people. Then he went to sleep, and when he woke, an angel was by him, with a cake baken on the coals, and a cruse of water. And the angel bade him rise and eat, for the journey was too great for him. It was a great journey, for he was to go all the way to the mount of God, where God had spoken to Moses. And there he stood in a cave. And a voice came and asked, What doest thou here, Elijah? Then he told how the Israelites had forsaken their God, and killed the prophets, and I, even I only, am left, he said, and they seek my life to take it away. Then God showed him his wonders. First, a great strong wind came rushing by, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then there was an earthquake that broke the rocks in pieces, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. Then Elijah wrapped his face in his mantle, and stood in the entrance of the cave to hear what God would say to him. And God told him he was not all alone, as he thought, for there are many good men still left who had never bowed the knee to Baal, nor deserted the God of their fathers. And God sent him back to return to his work among the people of Israel, and not to think that there was no hope because he could not see it, nor to think he was left alone because he had no friends near him that he could see. Third reading. He laid him down upon his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no bread. 1 Kings 21:4. You learn in the Catechism to say, Thou shalt not covet. Coveting means wishing very much for what we ought not to have, and God tells us not to covet, because all faults begin in bad wishes. Now, you shall hear what shocking sin one wish led to. King Ahab had a grand garden, and he wanted to make it bigger, but the next piece of ground belonged to a poor man named Naboth. Ahab asked Naboth to sell him his ground. But Naboth said it had come to him from his father, and must go to his son, and he could not sell it. Then Ahab coveted, and lay on his bed, and would not eat. caring for nothing but the bit of ground he could not get. Now Ahab had a cruel, wicked wife, and when she saw her husband grieving about Naboth's ground, she was determined to get it for him. So she had 2 very bad men set on to say that poor Naboth had been wicked, and must be put to death. They bore false witness against him, and broke the 9th commandment when they did so. And then, worst of all, this poor innocent man was really put to death for the crime he had never done. And that was murder, which breaks the 6th commandment. Then Jezebel called Ahab, and told him he might go and take possession of the ground that he wanted. There was nobody to hinder him. But he never had any pleasure in it. When he went to it, there stood God's great prophet Elijah, ready to meet him. And Elijah told him how very angry God was with him and with Jezebel, and that they should be terribly punished for their cruel behavior to this innocent man. Then Ahab was sorry, and wept and grieved for the cruel thing that had been done. But all his sorrow could not bring Naboth back to life again. And oh, how grieved he must have been that he had not kept his wishes in order, for almost all our thoughts begin in a wish. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 28th Sunday. Elijah and Elisha. First reading. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. 1 Kings 22:34. When Ahab had let Naboth be stoned, that he might get his vineyard, the prophet Elijah said that Ahab would be greatly punished, and that where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, there they would lick up Ahab's, and that cruel Jezebel should be eaten up by dogs, so that no one could say, "This is Jezebel." Some time after, Ahab went out to fight a battle. He was afraid, because his conscience troubled him, and he thought he should be safer if he did not go out to fight dressed like a king, for he knew the enemies would all come and try to kill him if they saw him in his robes. But he dressed only like a common captain, and thought they would take no notice, and he would be safe. He forgot that if the enemy did not know him, God knew him, and that God could see it was Ahab just as well in his common dress as in his robes and crown. So a man drew his bow, not shooting at anybody in particular, but God's will guided the arrow, and it wounded Ahab so badly that he desired to be taken out of the battle, and he died before he could be carried home. His chariot was full of his blood, and his servants washed it in the place where Naboth had been stoned to death, and the wild, hungry dogs came and licked up the blood, just as they had licked up Naboth's blood. So you see, no hiding could get away from God. Second reading. My father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. 2 Kings 2:12. The time had come when God was about to call away his great prophet Elijah, and it was not as other men are taken from this earth, by dying and being buried, while their souls go away to the God who gave them. No, Elijah went out and visited all the schools where young men and boys were being trained to sing God's praise. And Elisha, who was his scholar and his friend, went with him. When they came to the bank of the river Jordan, Elijah took his mantle, and rolled it up, and struck the waters of the stream with it, and they parted, and left a way for Elijah and Elisha to go over dry-footed. Then Elijah said, Ask what I shall do for thee, before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And while they were talking together, there came a great wonder from heaven, a chariot and horses, all bright and glowing like fire. And Elijah was parted from his friend, and went up into heaven upon a whirlwind. Elisha stood watching, crying out, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof, as if he knew not what he said. And Elijah, as he went up, threw down his mantle, and Elisha took it up and went his way, much wondering, and full of awe. And when he came to the river Jordan, he took the mantle, rolled up, and smote the waters, and they parted again, so that he went through with dry feet. And when the young men in the school of the prophets met him, they saw in his face and manner that the same spirit which had been on Elijah was on him, and they bowed themselves before him. Only one other man was ever taken up to heaven without dying, and he was Enoch, who lived before the flood. Our blessed Lord ascended into heaven, but he went up, he was not taken, and it was after he had died and risen again. Third reading. It is well. 2 Kings 4:26. Elisha was the prophet for Israel instead of Elijah. Now there was a good woman who saw him go by, and she said she would make a little room for him by the wall of her house, and put in a bed and a table and a stool and a lamp, so that he could go and rest there whenever he pleased. When Elisha saw it, he was pleased, and told her that if she wished for anything very much, he would pray God to give it to her. She answered that she dwelt among her own people, and wanted for nothing. But she had no child, and Elisha prayed for her, and God blessed her for her kindness to his servant, and by she had a son. But when he had grown into a boy, he went into the fields with his father to see the harvest, and the heat of the sun struck on his head, so that he cried out, My head, my head! And his father said, Carry him to his mother. But she could do him no good. He sat on her knees till noon, and then died. She did not stop to weep. She had her ass saddled, and rode away to seek for the man of God. And by she met him on the way, and she knelt down before him, and held him by his feet. Then he knew how it was, and he bade his servant Gehazi take his staff, and hasten on, and never rest till he had laid it on the child's face. Gehazi did so, but there was no voice nor any answer. So he went back and met his master, and said, The child is not awaked. Then Elisha came in, and found the child lying dead on his own bed. Then he stretched himself on the boy, and prayed to God that the soul might come back to the little one. And at last God granted the prayer, and the child's flesh grew warm. And Elisha prayed again, and the child sneezed 7 times as his breath came back, and he opened his eyes. Then the mother was called, and the child was given back to her, and she bowed herself to the ground, and gave thanks to God and his prophet. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 29th Sunday. Elisha's Miracles. First reading. Wash and be clean. 2 Kings 5:13. There was a poor little girl who was stolen away from her own home in Israel by Syrian soldiers and carried far from her mother and friends to be a slave. It must have been very sad and lonely, but God lets nothing happen but for good, and so this poor little captive maid did great good. Her master was named Naaman. He was the captain of the army, brave and strong. But he fell ill of a disease that no doctor could cure, and which would go on getting worse till he would die of it. The little maid was sorry for him, and though she was all alone in a heathen land, she had not forgotten about God and his prophets. And she told her mistress that at home, in Israel, there was a prophet who could cure her master by God's power. So Naaman set out in his chariot and came to the prophet's door. He thought the prophet would come out and strike his hand over the place and cure him directly, all the more because he was such a great man. But instead of that, the prophet sent out word to him that he was to wash 7 times in the river Jordan, and he would be well. This made Naaman very angry. He thought the bathing in Jordan would do no good, and that the prophet made light of him. And he turned and went away in a rage. Then his servants persuaded him. They said, "My father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean?" Naaman was wise enough to listen to them. He did go and wash in the river Jordan as the prophet bade him, and God gave the water the power to make him quite well again. Then he came back and thanked the prophet, and said he would never pray to any god again, but to the one true God, for it healed him. So you see, the little maid did great good to her master, both to his body and his soul, because she was good, and remembered her God, even when she is far away from home. Second reading. They that be with us are more than they that be with them. 2 Kings 6:16. The great enemies of the kings of Israel were the Syrians, who lived at Damascus. But whenever the Syrians made a plan to come and fight with the Israelites, God made it known to the prophet Elisha, and he told King Joram, so that the Israelite soldiers were always ready beforehand to fight with the Syrians. The king of Syria began to think one of his own men must tell Joram, but they said it was the prophet Elisha who told the king of Israel what was said in the most secret chamber of the king of Syria. Then the Syrians sent an army of men to take Elisha at Dothan and kill him. They came by night, and when Elisha's servant looked out in the morning, he saw horses and chariots all round the place. He was afraid and cried out, "Alas, my master! How shall we do?" But Elisha said to him, "Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them." And he prayed that the young man's eyes might be opened, that he might see. And so they were, to see the whole mountain round about full of chariots of fire and horses of fire, many, many more than the Syrians had, and all come to take care of Elisha. And God made the Syrians unable to see that Elisha was before them, and he led them all the way to Samaria, and put them before King Joram as his prisoners. Joram wanted to put them to death, but Elisha would not let him, and they were all sent safe home, and did not come back as enemies for a long time. And we know that, though we cannot see them, God's angels are still in great armies encamped all round about those who fear him to deliver them. Third reading. This day is a day of good tidings, 2 Kings 7:9. If King Joram had been good, he would have had no troubles, but he would let his mother Jezebel worship her false gods. So God sent the Syrians against him again, and they came all round Samaria and shut it in so close that nobody could get out, and all the food was eaten up, so that even such food as a donkey's head was so dear that hardly anybody could buy it, and everyone was getting starved. Joram was so angry that he said at last, in his wickedness, he would cut off Elisha's head the next day. But Elisha said quietly that tomorrow there would be quantities of food in the city, so that it would cost almost nothing. One of the king's lords laughed and said, "If the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be?" "Thou shalt see it with thine eyes," said Elisha, "but shalt not eat thereof." Now that night the Lord made the Syrians hear a great noise, as if an army was coming up to help the Israelites. And they were so frightened that they all fled away in the night, and left all their tents standing, and their armor in them, and their stores of food. In the early morning 3 poor leprous men, who could not get any food in Samaria, crept down to see if the Syrians would give them anything. Or they thought if the Syrians should kill them, that would be better than being starved. But when they came to the camp, there was nobody there. No soldiers, no horses, only tents full of rich dresses and fine armor, and, best of all, plenty of food. The hungry lepers went and ate, and then they thought they ought to go and tell the people in the town that all the Syrians were gone. So the king sent out to see 2 men upon lean, starved horses. They found it was all true, and everybody went rushing out to get food. The king sent the Lord, for it laughed at Elisha, to stand in the gate to keep order. But the people were so very hungry that they did not mind him, and he was knocked down, and trodden upon, and trampled to death. And so it came to pass that he saw the plenty, but did not eat of it, because he had mocked at the word of the Lord. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Captivating Bible Stories for Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 30th Sunday. The Ruin of Ahab's House. First reading. What hast thou to do with peace? 2 Kings 9:18. The Sunday before last, you heard how King Ahab was killed in battle. Though he had fancied that he could hide from God, his wife, Queen Jezebel, was left, and she had always been worse than he was, and she had brought up her son Joram to be very wicked too. When Joram had reigned as king for 12 years, God told his prophet Elijah to send a young man to anoint a captain called Jehu to be king instead of Joram. So the young man took some oil and went to the town where Jehu was, and said, "I have an errand to thee, O captain." Then he poured the oil on Jehu's head, and told him that God made him king of Israel. The other captains were glad to make Jehu king, and they made him sit on the top of a flight of steps, and blew with their trumpets, and shouted, "Jehu is king!" Then they all set out to conquer King Joram. Joram had his chariot made ready, and went out in it to meet Jehu, But as soon as they came in sight of one another, Jehu shot an arrow, and it struck Joram, so that he sank down in his chariot and died. Then Jehu went on into the town, and Jezebel thought she would still try to make friends with the people. So, instead of mourning for her son, she painted her face, and put on a headdress, and looked out at a window. Jehu said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And some of the servants looked out. He said, "Throw her down." So the servants threw Jezebel out of the window, and her blood sprinkled on Jehu's horses. But he went on, and went into the palace, and was made king, and had a feast. Then he sent out, and said that he would have Jezebel buried, for she was a king's daughter. However, when his men went out to look for her, they found that the wild dogs that ran about the streets had eaten up every bit of her, so that there is nothing left of her but her skull and her feet and the palms of her hands. You remember that God's prophet Elijah had told Ahab that the dogs should eat Jezebel because she was so cruel. She worshipped idols, and killed God's prophets, and had poor Naboth put to death that Ahab might have his vineyard, so God punished her. People need not hope that God will not punish what they have done wrong, for he will be quite sure to punish unless they are very sorry and pray to him to pardon them for Jesus Christ's sake. Second reading. Jehu destroyed Baal out of Israel. 2 Kings 10:28. When that fierce soldier Jehu was made king, the men of Israel cut off the heads of all Ahab's sons and grandsons, and made them up into 2 heaps at the city gates. And all the people who worshipped Baal were shut up in his temple, and every one of them killed. It is very sad and terrible, but God had commanded that people who prayed to idols should not live, because they taught the rest of the Israelites to be wicked too. When we hear about it, we must recollect that it is a fearful thing to turn away from serving God, and that he is sure to punish those who will not worship him. You are not likely to pray to an idol, but I hope you do say your prayers night and morning, and mind them as you say them. Not saying our prayers and not going to church is turning away from God, and it would be very sad and ungrateful to do that, for God has done much more for us than he did for the Israelites, and we know more about him than they did. Third reading. The arrow of the Lord's deliverance. 2 Kings 13:17. Elisha grew to be a very old man, and when at last he fell sick and was near his death, the king of Israel, whose name was Joash, came and kept by his bedside. Elisha said, "Open the window eastward," and he opened it. Then Elisha said, "Shoot," and Joash took his bow and shot an arrow. And Elisha said, "The arrow of the Lord's deliverance." Then he said, "Take the arrows, smite upon the ground." Joash struck 3 times on the ground, but he did not go on striking, for he did not think enough of God and his prophets to understand that if he obeyed Elisha, God would bless him. So Elisha told him if he had struck many times, he would have had a great many victories over the Syrians. But as he had only struck 3 times, he would only have 3 victories. For it is when people begin by obeying in little things that God gives them a great deal. Then the great prophet Elisha died and was buried, and Joash beat the Syrians 3 times, but no more, because he had not believed and obeyed. End of chapter 30.